Arthurian literature has affected the European heroic ideal profoundly, perhaps even as much as classical texts. Yet while everyone knows that Achilles is written of in the Iliad, few have heard of Chretien de Troyes' 5 romances which gave birth to the genre of Arthurian literature. Chretien was a French writer who lived in the early 12th century. He served in royal courts and received patronage for his works from Marie of France, daughter of King Louis VII and Eleanor of Aquitaine. His 5 Arthurian romances are sometimes said to be the first novels ever written because of their style and structure. And I would have to agree that out of all Arthurian literature, his are the most pleasing to read and the most artfully crafted in their meaning and structure. Before Chretien, Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote about Arthur as a military leader and about Merlin as his prophetic advisor. And we have a few other sources and authors who mention Arthurian characters. But with Chretien, Arthurian legend takes on recognizable form for the first time. In Chretien's 5 romances, the ideas of romance as we know it and of chivalry appear for the first time as integral elements of Arthurian legend, and Arthur appears for the first time as the king of a court of great knights, such as Lancelot, to whom we have no previous literary references. It is thought that Lancelot may be a Welsh demigod hero due to certain etymological connections, and Celtic mythology and gods such as Morgana are an integral part of the Arthurian mythos. And I mentioned it in one of my recent videos, but I want to mention again here that we get the word romance from this genre, but they were originally called romances because they were written in Romance, that is in dialect, in Chretien's case, Old French, rather than in Latin. So this is quite literally the origin of the idea of romance. It is unclear exactly what sources Chretien is making use of aside from Geoffrey, and where he is getting many of his names, but it is clear that he is making use of, in part, older Celtic and Welsh folk traditions. Giants, dwarves, fairies, and supernatural beings and occurrences appear frequently in Chretien's romances, and his writings are saturated with pagan themes and motifs. And this is also the case in other works of Arthurian literature, but Chretien's 5 romances, which would serve as the foundation of all Arthurian literature which followed, are most grounded in the mystical world and the heroic values of pagan Europe. And this is why I find his writings, in particular, so remarkable and enchanting. I believe that they represent an important development in the European heroic ideal. His writings emphasize the ideas of romance, beauty, and chivalry, which were already present in the writings of the Greeks and Norse, but are most fully elaborated upon and explored by Chretien. The idea of the Greek aristos, excellence, and nobility is the centerpiece of Chretien's romances. The knights compete to be the best in the realm of combat and martial prowess, but also in the realms of love and beauty. The beauty and fairness of the knights is often emphasized, as well as how desired they are by maidens and ladies. In the world of Arthurian romance, one cannot be the best knight without also being the most beautiful. This idea, of course, was present in antiquity with the Greeks in the idea of the kalos kai agathos, the beautiful and the good, which referred to the aristocracy, to the aristos. The youthfulness and sometimes almost feminine beauty of Greek heroes was often emphasized in their literature. Beauty, heroism, and nobility were inseparable. All were contained within the idea of the Greek hero. But in Chretien's romances, and in Arthurian literature in general, beauty is emphasized even more than in classical texts. In the world of Arthur, one can tell the nobility and prowess of a knight simply by his beauty, and knights readily devote themselves to the service of ladies for the sake of their beauty simply upon seeing them. beauty is treated as something which is inherently good and inherently godly. I will quote the passage which I quoted in my recent video on Arthurian romance again here. This is from Chretien's Eric and Enid, when Eric sees Enid for the first time. Quote, "The maid was charming in sooth, for nature had used all her skill in forming her. Nature herself had marveled more than 500 times how, upon this one occasion, she had succeeded in creating such a perfect thing. Never again could she strive successfully to reproduce her pattern. Nature bears witness concerning her that never was so fair a creature seen in all the world. In truth, I say that never did a suit the fair have such radiant golden tresses that she could be compared with this maiden. The complexion of her forehead and face was clearer and more delicate than the lily, but with wondrous art her face, with all its delicate pallor, was suffused with a fresh crimson which nature had bestowed upon her. Her eyes were so bright that they seemed like two stars. God never formed better nose, mouth, and eyes. What shall I say of her beauty?" End quote. In my recent video, I pointed out how nature is invoked here as a creator before any mention of God, which of course is quite pagan. But more generally, what we see from this passage is that the creator, whether God or nature, is described as valuing beauty highly and aiming at the creation of beauty. Chretien writes that nature herself had marveled more than 500 times how upon this one occasion she had succeeded in creating such a perfect thing. Never again could she so strive successfully to reproduce her pattern. Enid is described as a perfect creation, perfect because of her beauty and because of her natural poise and nobility, which is also mentioned. In Enid, nature succeeded in creating something so perfect that nature could never again replicate it. And this, of course, implies that nature, or God, since the two seem interchangeable here, aims at the creation of beauty and values its beautiful creations the most. In Chretien's texts, goodness and divinity are inseparable from beauty, and wickedness and evil are inseparable from ugliness. And this is a very pagan conception of good and evil. And it is actually the origin of Nietzsche's critique of Christianity. As Nietzsche points out in Genealogy of Morals, the original meaning of all Indo-European words which we have for evil referred to the peasantry, to the base, to the lowly, the ugly, and the crude. And all of the words for the good referred to the beautiful, noble, upright, aristocracy. And of course the word aristocracy comes from aristos, which meant precisely these qualities. Throughout Chretien's Eric and Enid, Eric's beauty is repeatedly remarked upon, as it is with all of the other knights, and people devote themselves to serve Enid simply for the sake of her beauty. This is a world in which beauty is inherently valued as one of the highest virtues, but beauty is nothing without the heroic virtue, which it is intimately connected with. The plot of Eric and Enid, in short, is as follows. Eric, the most beautiful and excellent knight in Arthur's court, wins the love of the beautiful Enid on one of his adventures. But he is so enamored with her that he neglects his knightly duties and spends his time making love instead of combat and adventure. And it's interesting to note that Chretien actually includes sex scenes in his writing. Not very explicit ones, but he'll say things like, "and then they enjoyed each other's bodies until they were exhausted." Again, not very chaste or Christian. And so Eric is neglecting his knightly duties and spending all of his time in bed with his lover Enid. But when he learns that he has lost his reputation throughout the land, he sets out with Enid at once in search of danger to once again prove himself to be the most excellent knight. For Eric, these adventures are a test of his martial abilities, but these adventures also serve as a test of Enid's love for Eric, since she had begun to doubt him, and he fears that his love has lost faith in his excellence. He fears that she has forgotten, or that she no longer believes that he is the best of all of the knights. So what is Chretien's essential message? In the ideal knight, love, romance, and beauty must be balanced by martial prowess and heroic virtue. It is these two elements which compose the conception of chivalry, and this again is a distinctly pagan conception of virtue, which is consistent with the European heroic tradition. Throughout the text, Eric's martial prowess is tested again and again, and he prevails against opponents who outnumber him or who appear stronger than him, even giants. And again, Enid's love for Eric and her loyalty to him is also tested. As Eric and Enid are returning from their adventures, they come upon a walled city. Guivre, the Prince of Wales who is accompanying them, warns Eric not to stop, since there is a great danger within the city. He says, quote, "Sire, do not treat this as a jest, for you will never learn the secret from me until you shall have promised me, by the love you have sworn to me, that never by you will be undertaken this adventure, from which no one escapes without receiving shame or death." End quote. Eric, of course, inquires about the danger at once, and Guivre says, quote, "Sire, I should fear that you might suffer some harm here. I know that there is so much boldness and excellence in your heart that were I to tell you what I know of the perilous and hard adventure, you would wish to enter it." End quote. Again, this is very pagan. In Eric's heart is boldness and excellence, the Greek arete, which compels him to seek out danger and adventure. Any knight who boasts to be his better, he must defeat in combat. Any peril which he hears to be unbeatable, he must best. In the heart of the knight is the drive to be the best, the same which was the centerpiece of the Greek heroic ideal. Guivre says that no one escapes this mysterious trial without receiving shame or death, and shame is likened to death throughout Chretien's work. Once again, this is a very pagan conception. For the Greeks, the Norse, and other heroic cultures, it was better to die than to be shamed. It was better to die in battle than to live as a coward, better to incur bodily harm than to shrink from danger. And this attitude is characteristic of all of the Arthurian knights. When Eric hears of this mysterious danger which Guivre speaks of, he of course wants to seek out the trial at once. And as Eric enters the city, the common people cry out, quote, "God defend thee, knight, from harm, for thou art wondrously handsome, and thy beauty is greatly to be pitied, for tomorrow we shall see it quenched. Tomorrow thy death is come. Tomorrow thou shalt surely die, if God does not guard and defend thee." End quote. Again, Eric's beauty is emphasized. The chivalric ideal at the heart of Arthurian romance is the same heroic ideal seen in the writings of the Greeks and the Norse, simply with more emphasis on what we call romance, which is essentially the incorporation of medieval Christian virtues, primarily the idea of love, into the heroic ideal. One could cite other virtues which are incorporated into these texts, such as mercy and chastity or modesty, as being Christian, and while emphasis on these virtues may be Christian, we do see precursors to them in the Greek and Norse traditions. In Arthurian literature, knights will often ask for mercy after being defeated, and mercy is usually granted in exchange for the service of the defeated or a favor at a later date. For example, after defeating one knight, Eric sends him back to Arthur's court to serve Guinevere. And after defeating Guivre when they first met, Eric requests that he protect Enid should harm ever come to Eric. This particular conception of mercy in exchange for combat is unique to the medieval conception of chivalry, but again, there is precedence for these things in the European heroic tradition. Honor and oaths are important. Hospitality is important. Treating your enemy with honor and so on are all integral to the European pagan tradition. As I've mentioned before, in the Iliad, warriors will stop when they notice another warrior wearing a helmet or a piece of armor which their great-grandfather gifted to their opponent's great-grandfather. And the two warriors will stop, embrace each other, recount old tales, and refuse to fight. This is how important honor and hospitality was to the Greeks. In the Iliad, Achilles notably does not grant Hector an honorable burial. He does not grant him mercy, but the text clearly maintains that it would have been honorable for Achilles to do so. It would have been the right thing to do by the honor codes of his time. His refusal to grant Hector an honorable burial is a departure from the norm. And the idea of romantic love, or at least its precursor, was certainly present in Greek and Norse literature. Penelope waits years for Odysseus' return, and Odysseus stays up on the beach when he is trapped on Calypso's island, crying and longing to be at home with his love. Jason and Medea have a passionate romance, and she runs away with him, though it of course ends poorly. Passionate love was a key element of the European heroic ideal long before Christianity, but it was not the centerpiece. So what we're seeing in Chretien's depiction of chivalry is not so much Christian virtue, but European heroic virtues, with an emphasis on love or romance, due to Christianity's influence, since Christianity, of course, holds love as God. And this romantic emphasis is what distinguishes the idea of chivalry from the classical heroic ideal. And besides this pagan heroic ideal, the texts are filled with pagan themes. So I want to do an analysis of Chretien's Lancelot, which I believe best illustrates the mystical world of Chretien. In Chretien's Lancelot, an unknown knight arrives at Arthur's court during the Ascension Day feast, which celebrates Christ's ascension to heaven after he descended into hell and freed the good souls which had been imprisoned there. The Ascension Day feast sets the context for this knight's proclamation that he has imprisoned the people of Arthur's land and household. The knight proclaims, quote, "I do not bring you news of them because I intend to return them to you. Rather, I want to inform you that you have neither wealth nor power enough to ensure their release, and you know well that you will die before you are able to. Rather, I want to inform you that you have neither wealth nor power enough to ensure their release, and you know well that you will die before you are able to come to their aid." From the start, we are given hints that the kingdom of Gorre, in which Arthur's knights, ladies, and maidens are imprisoned, is the Celtic otherworld, or land of the dead. Any suspicion that the knight's proclamation that, quote, "You know well that you will die before you are able to come to their aid," end quote, might be taken literally is reinforced by Arthur's resigned acceptance of the knight's assertion. Though Arthur is a great king, with the best of knights at his service, he seems to know that he has no power in this situation, which suggests that the mysterious knight is speaking of an otherworldly force beyond Arthur's control, something which he simply must accept, something which seems a lot like death. The notion that Queen Guinevere is being taken away to the land of the dead is reinforced by Chretien's description of her departure. Quote, "As she was led away by Kay, every man and woman who was present at court and saw this lamented as if she were already lying dead in her coffin. No one thought she would ever return alive." End quote. Additionally, the kingdom of Gorre is called the land whence no one returns, and can only be accessed by two treacherous bridges over or through rivers. This further supports the idea that Gorre is the Celtic otherworld, since it is a common motif for the land of the dead to be reached by crossing rivers or bridges in Indo-European mythologies. It is interesting to note that King Arthur takes a very passive role in Arthurian romance. He merely appears as the king, while his knights are the focus of the tales, and Arthur's wife, Guinevere, is engaged, of course, in an affair with Lancelot, the most beautiful and excellent knight of Arthur's court. So it is Lancelot, not Arthur, who sets out after Guinevere straight away. Notably, when Lancelot is in the Kingdom of Gorre, he is unable to recall his name. This resonates with ancient Greek mythology. As described by Plato in his myth of Ore, the dead drink from the waters of the Styx, which washes away their memories before they cross the water into the land of Hades. Something that could complicate the idea of Gorre as the underworld is that the people in the Kingdom of Gorre seem to be very much alive and able to die, as is also the case with Maleagant, the son of the King of Gorre. Lancelot and Gawain also both seem to be alive when in the Kingdom of Gorre, though this is not out of character with myths about living heroes traveling to the underworld. So we can confidently say, at least allegorically, that the Kingdom of Gorre is the land of the dead, and that Lancelot is taking on the role of the classical hero in his quest to save Guinevere, who takes on the role of Persephone. And we do know that Chretien was influenced by classical sources. At the beginning of Cleges, he boasts of translating Ovid into French. He often makes reference to Alexander and Caesar, and throughout Eric and Aeneid, his descriptions of the detailed scenes depicted on clothing, armor, and saddles is clearly influenced by either the Iliad or the Aeneid. So it makes perfect sense that we see Greco-Roman themes in Chretien's work as well as Celtic pagan themes. In pursuit of Guinevere, Lancelot comes upon a cart driven by a dwarf. The dwarf tells Lancelot that he can take him to Gorre, but he must enter the cart, which would be shameful for Lancelot. Lancelot is a knight, so he is supposed to ride a horse in Indo-European fashion, and this type of cart was used to transport prisoners and beggars. So Lancelot hesitates 2 steps before leaping into the cart, and it is at this moment that he incurs shame for his hesitation and cowardice. Chretien writes, quote, "He would regret this moment of hesitation and be accursed and shamed for it. Reason, who does not follow love's command, told him to beware of getting in, and admonished and counseled him not to do anything by which he might incur disgrace or reproach. But love urged and commanded him to climb into the cart at once." End quote. When Lancelot enters the Kingdom of Gorre, he also enters into an allegorical state of death, which we know from earlier that Chretien conflates with shame. Lancelot loses his identity from here onwards and is referred to simply as the Knight of the Cart, a title associated with the shameful deed of riding in the cart. Only Guinevere knows his true name. Lancelot, while not literally dead, has entered into a state of shame and loss of identity which resembles death, as he enters into this mysterious death-like land of Gorre. And this shows us how allegorical and moral meaning is woven into the text, allowing the text to be read on both a literal, worldly level, a knight getting into a cart, and a moral, spiritual one, a knight failing to follow the command of love. This whole construct of ideas, the association between shame and death, death and loss of identity, is also very pagan, and whether consciously or not, resembles Odysseus's death-like limbo state and loss of identity, which he experiences while he is lost at sea. During his adventures in the Land of Gorre, Lancelot discovers empty tombs etched with the names of Arthur's knights. Among them are the names of Gawain, Lionel, Yvain, and Lancelot himself. Lancelot's tomb reads, quote, "He who will lift this slab by his unaided strength will free the men and women in the land whence no one returns." End quote. This is a clear allusion to Christ's harrowing of hell after his death, and the breaking open of the tombs in Matthew after Jesus' resurrection. And this, of course, ties in with the theme of the Ascension Day feast, and it sets up Lancelot as a Christ figure, but again applies the pagan logic of a test of strength. Another strange occurrence happens when Lancelot is staying at a castle in Gorre with Gawain, who followed Lancelot after Guinevere as his companion. Lancelot sees a mysterious sight pass by the window, a coffin with a knight in it, accompanied by Queen Guinevere and a tall knight, and behind them is following a crowd. The reader might initially suspect that the tall knight is Meleagant, who is holding Guinevere prisoner, and who is described on the next page as a huge and mighty knight, and that the dead knight is Kay, who originally departed Arthur's court with Guinevere. However, after finishing the story, the reader will know that Kay never died, and will realize that this vision appears quite similar to the ending of the story, when Lancelot returns from Gorre, having killed Meleagant, who is being carried in a coffin, and with Guinevere and the people of Gorre accompanying them. The fact that Gawain and Lancelot are unable to catch up with this mysterious party, despite being on horseback, suggests that this sight is in some way otherworldly, and that in the Kingdom of Gorre, time may not be operating as it does normally. Both in the case of the names on the tombs and the sight of Guinevere and the coffin, Chretien seems to be playing with time and the supernatural. It is as if Gawain and Lancelot are halfway between the realms of the living and the dead, the concrete and the elusive. When Lancelot sees the queen pass by the tower, he tries to throw himself from the window. Gawain stops him, but the lady of the castle, where he and Gawain are lodged, says, quote, "He certainly should want to be killed, for he's better off dead than living. Henceforth his life is shamed, scorned, and wretched." End quote. Her assertion that Lancelot would be better off dead if he does not redeem his sin and humiliation from riding in the cart suggests that Lancelot is in an almost purgatorial state, trapped between life and death. Though he is alive, he is better off dead. This theme returns again later when Lancelot hears the rumor of Guinevere's death and laments, quote, "I do not know who hates me more, life who wants me, or death who refuses to take me." End quote. Though Lancelot is alive, he wishes that he were dead. The conflation of shame and death appears again and again throughout Chretien's work, and is again very pagan and very heroic. Achilles, when forced to choose between living with the shame of having caused his own friend's death, or avenging him at the cost of his own death, readily and passionately chooses death. Achilles' refusal to enter into battle, in other words, his outward cowardice, is the error which causes his shame and sorrow. For Lancelot, it is his hesitation before getting into the cart, which is his original sin. Chretien is also clearly making use of the Christian conflation of sin and death here. In Christian doctrine, sin is the literal cause of death in the world. Yet, when we look at the story of Hercules, we see a similar motif. Hercules' sin is the murder of his family in a fit of madness, and this brings shame and sorrow upon him, and he can only redeem himself and his honor by completing the 12 labors. This is the narrative arc used by Chretien in Lancelot as well as in Eric and Enid. Eric's sin was neglecting his knightly duties and giving too much into love. Lancelot's sin was not giving himself fully to love. Here we see again the two crucial elements of the chivalric ideal, martial prowess and romantic passion. It is only at the end of the text that Lancelot learns from Guinevere that his sin was failing to get into the cart without hesitation, despite being ashamed and frightened of it. Lancelot says, quote, "There is no doubt that he who obeys love's command is uplifted, and all should be forgiven him. He who dares not follow love's command errs greatly." End quote. Lancelot here describes love as the ultimate virtue, even standing in for Christ himself. Those who follow love are redeemed, while those who do not err or sin. But one should also note that the use of love here, while clearly influenced by Christianity, also has a classical and pagan connotation. The love which Lancelot speaks of is linked with bravery, boldness, and daring, with the virtue of throwing one's own safety and one's own shame to the wind in a fit of passion, just as Achilles did for the love of his friend. It was Lancelot's hesitation, which is distinctly unheroic, which placed him in a state between life and death, in a state of error and sin. This is made clear when Lancelot at last defeats Maleagant in single combat and has him at his mercy. Chretien writes, quote, "Maleagant was so enraged he could not speak a word, not even to ask for mercy, because his foolish heart, which bound him and held him prisoner, had so besotted him. Lancelot approached, unlaced Maleagant's helmet, and cut off his head. Never again would Maleagant deceive him. He had fallen in death, finished." End quote. It is Maleagant's foolish heart which ultimately causes his death by preventing him from asking for mercy, just as it was Lancelot's heart, or failure to fully obey it, which bound him and held him prisoner throughout the text. Lancelot is only lifted from his loss of identity and allegorical state of death by reconciliation with Guinevere. Again, one might think back to the Odyssey, where Odysseus is only lifted from his own metaphorical state of death and loss of identity by slaying the suitors, freeing his kingdom, and at last making love with his wife Penelope. The idea of love and romance was always present in the classical pagan tradition, but it was not codified into a concrete and explicit ideal as the heroic ideal was. The values of beauty, love, and passionate romance was always an implicit part of the stories of these heroes, but it is only in the medieval chivalric ideal that romance is elevated to be equally as important as heroism in the knight. And I believe that the idea of romance is an extremely important development in the heroic ideal. Romance is the heroic view of love and of gender relations, and the ideas of chivalry and romance are important in preventing the heroic ideal from becoming purely He-Man masculinity worship like the modern manosphere. Even the Spartans, perhaps the most austerely militaristic and masculine warrior society in the history of the West, highly valued their women, so much so that the Athenians called them crazy for the freedom and influence which their women held. And although Athenian society seems to have been fairly restrictive on their women, in their literature, perhaps because it was inherited from an older time, women are often depicted as heroic, virtuous, and fearsome. The same is true of Norse literature. An essential part of the heroic ideal is the relationship between the sexes viewed through a heroic light, gender roles viewed through a heroic, life-affirming light. And this is why, while some claim that the idea of romance comes from Christian influence, I believe it is more accurately described as a pagan heroic conception, which was brought to the forefront in Arthurian literature by Christianity's emphasis on love. Nowhere in the New Testament does Christ talk about the rules of chivalric courtship or winning the love of beautiful maidens through heroic feats. Nowhere does he talk about dying for the sake of a lover or for honor. The love of the New Testament is quite different, and the later Arthurian texts, which espouse the virtues of the New Testament, condemn Lancelot for his love affair with Guinevere. They condemn him for not being a virgin, and for fighting for the sake of glory and love rather than the sake of God, for in this way being selfish rather than selfless. The love which Christ espouses in the New Testament is agape, an all-encompassing, selfless love, not romantic passion. But I'm not some sort of anti-Christian zealot either. When I attack Christianity, it is because of what I perceive to be its detrimental or subversive effects, such as the condemnation of Lancelot as a sinner. My commitment is to the heroic worldview, and when that worldview takes on Christian flavor and puts Christ at its head, as in Chretien's 5 romances, I fully support it, and the medieval Christian emphasis on love and passion was certainly important for bringing out, expanding upon, and solidifying the pagan idea of romance, just as the Greeks did with the idea of heroism. And the ideas of romance and chivalry have influenced the development of the heroic ideal since the early Middle Ages. The first Disney princess movies, Sleeping Beauty, Beauty and the Beast, and so on, while inspired by Grimm's tales, have a distinctly Arthurian ethos and feel to them in their portrayal of romance, heroism, and the heroic feminine. And these movies, as well as the tales of King Arthur, inspired heroism in me as a child. So it is my belief that Chretien's 5 romances are extremely important texts in the heroic canon, which represent an important development in the heroic worldview. And it has been the task of my channel to track the development of this worldview, to explore its key texts, and to identify its key elements. And it is my highest hope that this heroic worldview and the literature and history which birthed it can form the basis of a new yet ancient civilizational project on the same scale as the biblical one. In this way, if I may be so presumptuous, I feel that I am helping to continue the project which Nietzsche began, or at least brought into modernity, the solidification of a worldview counter to every presumption and aim of Christianity and of liberalism as they have manifested and acted in modernity, counter to the trajectory of the West since the early Middle Ages. In the heroic tradition, I see a solution to modernity. I see a history, a value system, an understanding of life and nature, and I see a goal in the future. I see the Superman.
If you're interested in more in-depth explorations like this, check out the ARC's Heroic Literature course. The link is in the description. Thank you for your support.